Yavapai County, Arizona, March 11th, 1895. 6 in the morning, the canyon still in shadow. Walter Burns had been a mining foreman for 11 years. He was 37 years old, a spare and sun-darkened man from Illinois who had come to the Arizona Territory in 1884 following the silver discoveries at Prescott, and had stayed through the silver bust because the gold in the Bradshaw Mountains was consistent enough to keep a man employed, if not wealthy. He worked for the Continental Gold Mining Company, whose operation in the southern Bradshaws was a mid-scale placer and hard rock operation, running 3 shafts and 2 surface operations, with a crew that varied between 20 and 30 men by season. Walter Burns managed the underground operations, which meant he was the first man down each morning and the last man up each evening, and had spent 11 years developing the kind of comprehensive knowledge of a mine's behavior that does not come from education, but from continuous physical presence in a specific underground space over a long period. He knew the Continental shafts the way a physician knows a patient he has treated for years, not just the current condition, but the history of it, the previous conditions that had made the current condition intelligible. On the morning of March 11th, 1895, he went down the main shaft at 6 o'clock and began his standard pre-shift inspection of the working faces, which was his routine before the crew came down. He reached the lowest working level, 200 feet below the surface, the floor of the 3rd shaft extension, and he was examining a section of the southern face where the previous day's blast had opened new material, and the face that the blast had opened included, at its lower left corner, a void. Not a gas pocket, not a small natural cavity. A void of deliberate dimensions that the blast had partially uncovered, opening a roughly triangular aperture approximately 18 inches wide at its base and 2 feet high at its apex, through which the air of the shaft's lower level moved with a quality that Burns recognized in the first second. Old air. Air that had been still for a very long time. He had encountered gas pockets before, and he had encountered natural voids before, and neither of them produced air with this quality. Gas pocket air was chemical. Natural void air was cold and damp and mineral. This air was dry and still, and carried a quality he could not name, which in his field notes he kept in a standard ledger book that he maintained as a record of daily underground conditions, he described as the air of an interior space long kept from any contact with the outside. He did not enlarge the opening. He was a careful man, and he knew that an unknown void below 200 feet in a gold mine in the Bradshaws was not something to be investigated alone by lamplight before the crew came down. He made a sketch of the aperture in his field notes, and he noted the dimensions, and he went back up, and he waited for the crew. When the crew came down, he took 2 of them with him. A Cornish miner named Robert Blewett, who was 42 and had been with the Continental for 6 years, and a younger man named George Watts, 26, who was in his 3rd season underground. And he told them he had found a void, and they were going to look at it carefully before doing anything else. He had Watts and Blewett clear the aperture by hand while he held the lamp. The clearing took 35 minutes. What they opened was a passage, not a natural formation, but a cut passage, the walls and ceiling dressed to a consistent rectangular cross-section, approximately 24 inches wide by 36 inches high. Too low and narrow for a standard man to transit in any position other than a tight crawl. The passage ran horizontally into the rock for approximately 15 feet before it opened into a chamber. Burns went in on his hands and knees with the lamp ahead of him. He was in the passage for 2 minutes, which was the time it took to cover 15 feet while managing a lamp. He entered the chamber, and he raised the lamp, and he looked at what was in the chamber, and he stayed on his hands and knees for a moment before he got to his feet, because what he was looking at required him to be still for a moment. The chamber was approximately 10 feet wide and 8 feet deep and 6 feet high. The walls were dressed granite, the cutting marks still faintly visible. Regular, parallel marks made by a tool whose blade width Burns estimated at approximately 3 inches. The floor was level, cut from the native rock, with a surface worn smooth in a way that suggested long use rather than deliberate polishing. Along 3 walls, the 2 sides and the back, there were niches cut into the granite at regular intervals. The niches were each approximately 24 inches wide and 18 inches tall and 12 inches deep, positioned with their bases at a height of approximately 2 feet from the floor. 8 niches. Burns counted them twice. In each niche was a figure. He held the lamp close to the nearest niche, the one on the left wall closest to the passage entrance. The figure was seated, its back against the rear of the niche, its lower limbs arranged in a cross-legged position, its hands resting on what would have been its knees. It was mummified. The conditions of the sealed chamber, dry, stable, at a consistent underground temperature for a very long period, had preserved it with a completeness that Burns found difficult to look at directly, because it looked more like a living person in miniature than like anything he had expected to find in a granite niche 200 feet below the surface of the Bradshaws. The preserved tissue of the face was intact. The features were present. The hands were distinguishable as hands, the fingers individually visible. The skin color was very dark, the darkness of long mummified tissue. He measured the figure with his hand. The span from the base of the seated figure to the top of the skull was 18 inches. He measured the other 7. The smallest was 18 inches. The largest was 24 inches. They were all in the same seated position. They were all in the same orientation, facing into the chamber, facing the passage entrance, facing whatever had come through the passage before Walter Burns. He sketched them. This is the central fact of the Yavapai case. Walter Burns was a man who kept field notes and who carried his ledger with him on shift, and who responded to finding 8 18 to 24-inch mummified figures in sealed granite niches 200 feet underground by taking out his ledger and his pencil and making drawings. The drawings survive. They are in the Charlotte Hall Museum's archive in Prescott, Arizona, where Burns's ledger was donated by his daughter in 1941, 9 years after his death. The ledger contains 19 pages of routine mining records from the Continental operation, and 6 pages relating to the March 11th discovery. The 6 pages include 2 pages of written description in Burns's compact and precise hand, 3 pages of sketches, elevation views of the chamber, plan views of the niche arrangement, individual figure sketches at 2 different scales, and 1 page of measurements organized in a table with each figure numbered and each measurement recorded. The sketches show human proportions, not the proportions of infants or of pathological developmental cases, the proportions of adults at a reduced scale. The head-to-body ratio in Burns's drawings is consistent with mature human proportion, not with infant proportion, which shows a significantly larger cranium relative to torso. The limb proportions, the length of the forearm relative to the upper arm, the length of the lower leg relative to the upper leg, are consistent with adult human skeletal proportions at every scale. Burns was not an anatomist. He was a mining foreman who drew what he saw. What he drew shows adult human proportions at between 18 and 24 inches of total height. He established the age of the geological context using the same stratigraphic method that had been applied to similar questions in the Arizona Territory by the Territorial Geologist's Office. Not an absolute dating, which was beyond the methods available in 1895, but a relative assessment based on the characteristics of the cut stone, the mineral deposits on the chamber surfaces, and the position of the chamber relative to the known stratigraphy of the shaft. Burns was not a geologist, but he had worked underground in the Bradshaws for 11 years, and he understood the rock sequences the operation had cut through. His assessment, recorded in the ledger, was that the geological layer in which the chamber was cut corresponded to the pre-Holocene stratigraphy identified by the company's geological survey as the foundation horizon, the horizon below which no post-glacial disturbance of any kind had been documented in the Continental's operations. He estimated the minimum age of the horizon at 3,000 years. He wrote this in the ledger with the same tone he used for ore grades. Robert Blewett and George Watts entered the chamber after Burns and confirmed what Burns described. Blewett's account, given to the Arizona Weekly Journal miner correspondent Henry Clark in April 1895, is consistent with Burns's field notes on every physical detail: the 8 niches, the 8 figures, the dimensions, the condition of preservation, the seated orientation. Watts did not give a formal account to any journalist, but he described what he had seen to a fellow miner named Arthur Cole, who described it in turn to Clark as part of the same April 1895 Journal Miner piece. Cole's second-hand account also matches the physical record. Burns reported the find to the Continental's mine superintendent, a man named James Lowell, on the morning of March 11th, after the 3 men had returned to surface. Lowell went down and entered the chamber himself. He spent 20 minutes inside. He told Burns that the chamber was to be secured and that no further access was to be permitted until the company's management in San Francisco had been notified. Burns secured the passage entrance with a timber barrier and a padlock, and retained the only key. The Continental's San Francisco office responded within 1 week. A letter to Lowell, dated March 17, 1895, which Lowell kept and which his son donated to the Yavapai County Historical Society in 1962, instructed him to seal the chamber and to treat the discovery as confidential. The letter did not explain the basis for the confidentiality instruction. It was signed by the company's general manager, whose name appears in the letter as A.D. Fletcher. The instruction to seal came with a reference to having been advised by the proper federal authority, which Lowell's son described in a cover note with the donated letter as a phrase his father had never explained. The Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of American Ethnology sent a field operative to the Continental mine in April 1895, approximately 3 weeks after the San Francisco office's letter. His name was Lawrence Hayward, 31 years old, a junior member of the Bureau's field staff who had previously worked mound sites in the Ohio Valley. Hayward's travel to Arizona is documented in the Bureau's administrative travel records. His field report from Yavapai County is not in the Bureau's published or unpublished series. He was at the Continental mine for 4 days. When he left, Burns's padlock on the passage entrance had been replaced with a different padlock, whose key Burns did not have. Burns was not given access to the chamber again. He worked at the Continental through the end of the 1895 season and left the company in December 1895, 9 months after the discovery. He did not cite the discovery as the reason for leaving. He continued to work in Arizona mining operations through 1910 and retired to Prescott. He died in 1932. His ledger was not something he discussed publicly during his working life. His daughter, who donated it to the Charlotte Hall Museum in 1941, said that her father had shown it to her once in the early 1920s and had described the March 11th discovery in terms consistent with the ledger's written record. She said he believed that what he had found was real and that it had been removed from the mine and that no one was going to acknowledge it publicly. She said he was not bitter about this. He was a practical man. He had found what he found, and the institution had come and taken it, and that was how things worked. And he had kept the ledger because he was a man who kept records, and the record deserved to exist, even if it went nowhere. The physical impossibility at the center of the Yavapai case is specific. Mummified remains preserved in a sealed granite chamber at 200 feet depth for a minimum of 3,000 years, showing adult human proportions at a scale between 18 and 24 inches, in a geological context whose stratigraphy places them below any horizon of post-glacial human activity documented in the Arizona Territory. The Hohokam culture, which represents the most sophisticated prehistoric population in the Yavapai County region, was active from approximately 300 BC to 1400 AD, and at no point in its documented record produced individuals of the dimensions Burns sketched or inhabited spaces of the construction quality he described at 200 feet below the Bradshaws. The chamber's cut stone construction, the dressed granite niches, the level floor, the rectangular passage, required a lapidary technology that is not represented in any Hohokam archaeological context. The preservation of the 8 figures, if the chamber had been sealed for 3,000 years, required atmospheric and humidity conditions within the sealed space that the sealed granite chamber would have provided. A consistent underground temperature, low humidity, absence of biological activity. These conditions are entirely consistent with the environment Burns described. Dry air, stable walls, no moisture infiltration. The Yavapai County region's oral tradition includes accounts from the Yavapai people of small beings living within the mountains that predate European contact. The ethnographic record of these traditions was assembled by the anthropologist Edward Spicer in fieldwork conducted in the 1930s and published in the journal American Ethnology in 1942. Spicer noted the traditions as consistent across multiple informants and as describing the small mountain beings as distinct from the Yavapai people. Not supernatural entities, but physical beings understood to have inhabited the range before the Yavapai's own occupation of the territory. He made no connection to any archaeological find. The Continental Gold Mining Company's operations in the southern Bradshaws were suspended in December 1896, 18 months after the March 1895 discovery. The company filed for reorganization in 1897. The mine property, approximately 300 acres in Yavapai County, was acquired in reorganization proceedings by the Bradshaw Mountains Land and Resources Company, incorporated in Delaware in November 1896. The Delaware incorporation predates the reorganization filing by 6 weeks. The Bradshaw Mountains Land and Resources Company has never filed a mining permit in Arizona. The property taxes have been paid continuously since 1897. The registered agent is a Wilmington law firm whose current principals have no documented connection to mining or to Arizona. A Freedom of Information request filed in March 2022 by the researcher Carol Finch, requesting all Bureau of American Ethnology field records for Yavapai County, Arizona, for the period 1890 through 1910, received a partial response covering 12 documents. None of the 12 documents references the Continental mine. Lawrence Hayward's 4 Days in Yavapai County in April 1895 produced no document in the partial response. The exemption cited for withheld materials was Exemption 3, referencing a Federal Museum Collections statute. The statute reference does not cover field records. It covers physical specimens. Field records are administrative records subject to standard Freedom of Information disclosure requirements. Walter Burns's sketches are in the Charlotte Hall Museum archive in Prescott in a climate-controlled document box, drawer 11 of the Historical Records collection. The ledger is 11 inches by 7 inches, covered in red cloth worn dark at the corners from 11 years of underground handling. The 6 pages of the March 11th record are in the middle of the ledger, preceded and followed by routine shift logs. The figures in Burns's drawings are seated in their niches, with their hands on their knees and their faces directed outward, toward the passage, toward whatever came through. The dimensions in the table on the last of the 6 pages are recorded in Burns's compact hand. 18 inches, 19 and a half, 20, 20, 21, 22, 22, 24. He numbered them 1 through 8 from left to right along the left wall, continuing along the back wall and the right wall. The largest is number 7 on the right wall, second from the passage end. The passage is sealed. The Continental's third shaft was capped in 1897 during the reorganization. The cap is concrete. The Bradshaw Mountains Land and Resources Company's property boundary encompasses the shaft location and the surface area above the chamber. There is a gate at the access road. The gate was installed in 2017. The camera mounted on the gate post is weathered to a degree inconsistent with a 2017 installation. Either the camera predates the gate, or it was transferred from a previous gate structure. Behind the gate, 200 feet below the surface, the chamber is sealed in the way it was sealed before Burns's blast opened it, except that the 8 niches are empty now. The figures that sat in the niches for 3,000 years were in the niches for 3 weeks after Burns found them. And then Lawrence Hayward came, and 4 days later, the padlock was a different padlock, and Burns did not have the key. The figures are not in any Smithsonian catalog. They are not in any accessible institutional inventory. They are in Burns's sketches, 18 to 24 inches tall, seated with their hands on their knees, drawn by a man who kept records because records deserve to exist, even if they went nowhere. The 6 pages of Burns's ledger that cover the March 11th discovery are not the only documentation the find produced in its immediate aftermath. Robert Blewett, the Cornish miner who entered the chamber behind Burns, gave his account to the Arizona Weekly Journal miner's Henry Clark in April 1895. Blewett was a methodical man from Camborne who had worked hard rock mines in Cornwall before emigrating, and he brought to his description of the chamber the technical vocabulary of a man who had spent years examining worked stone and assessing mining construction. His account, published in the Journal Miner on April 14, 1895, confirms Burns's measurements and adds 2 details that Burns's field notes do not include. First, Blewett said the floor of the chamber had markings. Not the niche markings, the floor itself. At the center of the chamber, roughly equidistant from all 4 walls, there was a section of floor approximately 3 feet in diameter that showed a different surface quality from the surrounding stone. Not a depression, not a raised area, a circular section that had been treated differently from the rest of the floor. Blewett described the surface of this section as polished, in contrast to the worn but unpolished surface of the rest of the floor. He pressed his hand against it. It was smooth in a way that the surrounding stone was not. He thought it had been rubbed with a material, oil or mineral compound, rather than mechanically polished. The rubbing, if that was what it was, had been applied and had penetrated the stone surface enough to change its character permanently. He could not estimate when this had been done. Second, Blewett said the figures in the niches were not identical. He examined 4 of the 8 closely, the 4 on the left wall and the back wall, and noted that 2 of them had a different positioning of the hands. 6 of the 8 figures had the hands resting on the knees, as Burns had recorded. 2, the second and third figures from the left on the back wall, had the hands raised to the level of the chest, pressed together palm to palm. Blewett described the palm-to-palm position with care because it struck him as the same position he had seen his grandmother use in prayer. He was a Methodist, and the position meant something to him culturally, and he noted it because it seemed like it meant something to whoever had placed the figures in the niches. And whatever it meant, it was different from what the other 6 figures were doing with their hands. The distinction between 6 figures in one hand position and 2 in another is not an arbitrary variation. It is a distinction that implies intentional differentiation, a population of 8 where 2 individuals, positioned together in the back of the chamber, are distinguished from the 6 by a specific gesture. The 2 figures distinguished by the raised hands may represent a different status, a different role, or a different moment in a cultural practice that used this chamber for purposes that its architecture, sealed with 8 niches at consistent spacing, with a polished central floor, was designed to serve. Burns did not note the palm-to-palm distinction in his field notes because he did not examine the individual figures as closely as Blewett did. Burns's sketches show all 8 figures with hands at the knee, the position he saw on the figures he examined most closely, the first ones on the left wall. Blewett's April account in the journal Minor is the only documentation of the 2 distinguished figures. It was published once in a local Arizona paper in 1895, and has not been cited in any subsequent published work. The suppression mechanics of the Yavapai case are less elaborate than those of some comparable sites, but they are no less complete. The Continental Gold Mining Company did not require complex corporate restructuring to disappear the Bradshaw Mountains site. It required a letter from San Francisco dated March 17th, instructing Lowell to seal the chamber and treat the discovery as confidential, with a reference to having been advised by the proper federal authority. The phrase, proper federal authority, is the load-bearing element of that letter. It transfers the decision from a private mining company to a federal institution whose involvement is acknowledged in the letter, but not identified by name. Lawrence Hayward's 4 days at the Continental in April 1895 constitute the federal institution's physical presence. His Bureau of American Ethnology travel authorization is in the administrative record. His field report is not. The 4 days produced no document in the Bureau's published or unpublished series. They produced a padlock that Burns could not open, because the key to the replacement padlock left with Hayward when he left the property. The 8 figures from the Yavapai County Chamber are in the institutional record only through Burns's sketches and Blewett's newspaper account. They are not in any Smithsonian catalog. They are not in any Bureau of American Ethnology accession list for 1895. Lawrence Hayward's travel records show he went to Yavapai County. What he brought back from Yavapai County is not documented in any accessible record. The 8 figures were in the chamber when he arrived. Burns's padlock was on the passage entrance when Hayward came, and Hayward entered the chamber during his 4 days at the Continental, because the whole point of his presence was the chamber. They were not in the chamber after he left, because Burns's padlock was replaced with a different padlock when Hayward departed, and Burns was not given access again. The logical sequence is not ambiguous. Walter Burns was 37 years old when he went down the main shaft at 6 o'clock on the morning of March 11, 1895, with the intention of inspecting the previous day's blast face before the crew came down. He was a foreman, and pre-shift inspection was his job, and he had been doing it for 11 years. And on this morning, the pre-shift inspection produced a void in the blast face that contained a passage, that contained a chamber, that contained 8 figures in niches that had been sealed in that chamber for at least 3,000 years. He got out his ledger. He took 6 pages of notes. He made 3 pages of sketches. He drew a table of measurements. He did this because he was a man who kept records, and the record of what he found on March 11th deserved to exist, regardless of what happened to the thing it described. His daughter said this was his reason. She said he told her once, in the early 1920s, that the record was the only thing he had kept that was worth keeping. The ledger is in the Charlotte Hall Museum in Prescott. The figures in the ledger's sketches sit in their niches with their hands on their knees, 6 of them, and 2 with their hands pressed together at the chest, though Burns did not note the 2, and Blewett's April account in the journal Minor is the only place the distinction is documented. The chamber is sealed. The passage is sealed. The shaft cap is concrete. The gate is steel, 2017. The camera is older than the gate. The 8 niches are empty. Whatever Burns's sketches preserve of their original occupants is what remains above ground. Below ground, in the sealed chamber, the polished circular section of floor at the center is still there, at 200 feet below the surface of the Bradshaws, In the dark that burns his lamp was the last light to